Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on AI, data and automation, legal risks and technical solutions. My name's Phoebe Chester and I'm a senior lawyer for LegalVision, and I'm joined today with one of our partners, Shaun, Leisegang, who's the General Manager of Automation, Data and AI at Tecala. So before we begin today, I just wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping matters and then we can jump into some of the content. But you'll be receiving the recording and the slides in an email after the webinar, so don't worry too much about taking notes of what you see. A poll question is also probably popped up for you on the screen now, so feel free to answer those questions, which is helpful for us to understand, what matters to you and what questions we can best answer to help you navigate this space. We'll also have an opportunity for some questions at the end of the webinar, so you can pop those in the chat and we'll try and get to as many as we can. And once we've completed the webinar, please submit a survey with feedback. It's great to hear how you've found it. And by viewing this webinar, you are actually also eligible to receive a complimentary consultation with LegalVision to discuss how we can help your business. So if you'd like to claim this, just leave your contact details in the survey that appears at the end. We can get in touch. Okay, so moving on to the agenda, there's a couple of items we're going to be discussing today between Shaun and myself. First up, it'll be a market update about the latest trends in AI, data and automation. And then we'll move on to learning from some of the live case studies that Shaun's got experience with. So in particular, we'll be talking about My Plan Manager and their experience. And then we'll dive into some of the legals as well that accompany these concepts with some automation, legalities, data privacy and IP ownership. And then we can have an opportunity to have a go at the Q&A. So before we jump in, I might just see if we've had some results to that poll yet. So if you haven't done it yet, please jump it in now. And I'll pass over to Shaun as well so we can, oh, hang on, I've just got the poll results in now. So which area of AI, data and automation presents the most significant challenge to your business? The majority, 57%, is all of the above. The second highest answer is privacy, which I absolutely agree with. I think that that's the right mindset to have. And then there's also interest in market trends and IP ownership. So that's great. I'll hand over to Shaun now and we can get started on some of the content that we'll be taking you through.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Phoebe. And yeah, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session. So yeah, it is amazing to see that many people are just struggling to keep up with what's happening out there in the wider world. Don't feel alone. I do all things automation, data and AI every day of my life, and things are changing every minute, every hour, every day. So there's a lot of things going on. But let's try to demystify some of the things for you today. I wanted to start off today just talking a little bit about more the macro strategy. So kind of what are some of the things we're seeing in each of these categories? So what we're doing here is we're going to start off with kind of automation, right? So automation is no longer a cost-cutting measure. It's a survival strategy. So what do I mean by that? Well, we're heading into a world where people are the constraint and it's no longer the technology. And what I mean by that is there's countries like Japan and South Korea that are already experiencing population decline, right? And Australia is not too far behind them. So really, this is no longer theoretical. It's a demographic reality, and we're going to need to use automation as a survival strategy. Also, what we're seeing out there is roles aren't just hard to fill. There's many roles that are just disappearing entirely from the talent market. So we've got things like finance and admin and customer service. The work still needs to be done, but people being available to do some of that work anymore isn't as kind of available as it was previously. And automation is how we're going to scale the way when humans are no longer available. And we're going to have to complement all of our human users with automation to do things quicker, better, faster, and to help us with kind of surviving in this new world. Now, moving on to data, there is a massive data explosion at the moment, right? This is a stat, over 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years. Now, that is absolutely insane to think about, right? That's no longer an evolution, it's a digital explosion, and we've never ever seen something like it before in human history. We've got everything starting to generate data, people, systems, machines, and increasingly AI itself. So AI is generating and creating some of this data, and the volume is absolutely staggering. But the challenge is more data doesn't mean that we're making better decisions unless it's accessible, it's structured, it's secure. And that's where automation, AI, and governance come in, where we can turn that chaos into competitive advantage. If we look at what's happening in the AI and the generative AI world, generative AI is the biggest inflection point since the internet. And really what I mean by that is there's many, many inflection points in the history of the world and specifically technology. Prior to generative AI, it really was the internet and the invention of email that actually was a big inflection point. So we need to figure out how we can use generative AI inside our businesses and inside our daily life to kind of augment us as humans and to be able to use this great technology. Now, this is the first technology that's capable of performing what we thought were uniquely human functions. And what I mean by that is previously drafting legal documents or generating marketing strategies or even writing code or advising customers were only possible using humans. But now some of that is possible using technologies like generative AI. And the adoption that we're seeing is outpacing every tech wave that we've ever seen before. So faster than things like smartphones, social media, or even the internet itself. ChatGPT hit 100 million users in 2 months. So this is no longer an experiment, right? It's here. Your competitors are already embedding it in operations, and we need to figure out how we might be able to use this to great advantage. Now, really what we're seeing out there is companies are starting to investigate or already on the journey of how they can combine the worlds of automation, data, and AI. And really why they want to combine these three technologies is to supercharge their business operations. And what I mean by this is some companies might start with automation, some might start with data, some might start with AI, but really when you can combine these three worlds, that's really where you can create magic inside your business. And really, I often talk to customers about, well, why would you want to do this? Well, there's really three reasons why you might want to combine these three worlds. And really, they're quite simple. We either want to kind of help companies make more money. And how we do that is by doing things quicker, better, or faster. We either want to help companies save time or money. And really, what we want to do there is help them to do more with less. Or alternatively, companies want to use these technologies because they have to, right? And that's the world of regulatory compliance and the like. So really, that's why we're using these three technologies to supercharge business operations. Now, if we break down very quickly into each of these technologies, what do I mean by each of them? Well, firstly, let's start off with data. So in this new era, data is really our currency, but it's only our currency if it's clean, it's connected, and we can use that data to great effect. But the honest reality is most organizations are drowning in data, but they're starving for the insight that that data can actually give us. So the real challenge isn't capturing the data. The real challenge is actually about unlocking the value from that data. And businesses need to turn that dark data that's hidden in emails, documents, legacy systems into something that helps them drive faster, better decisions. And that's critical because the AI you build is only as good as the data you feed it. So data is an absolutely critical aspect. Next up, if we look at kind of the wonderful world of automation, inside the automation world, we're not just automating to save time, we're automating because the human workforce is under pressure, right? And that was some of the macro kind of statistics that I shared with you. Automation acts as that digital backbone between systems, teams, and data. And when done right, it routes tasks seamlessly between systems and people. It escalates to us only when needs to, and it frees up you and I as human users to perform that higher value work and use our unique skills. So those are things like creativity, judgment, relationship building, and all of those wonderful things. So automation is really the way that businesses scale without burning out. And last but not least, if we look at the wonderful world of artificial intelligence, this gives us the thinking layer. And what AI can do for us, it can summarize, it can classify, it can predict, and it can even generate, but only if the data is right and only if automation is there to act on the insights that AI gives us. So the most powerful results happen when these three layers, data, automation, and AI, work together. But of course, with great capability comes a lot of risk, and that's where we're going to spend some time today, especially when this AI is starting to make decisions for us or interacting with customers. We need to make sure that there's governance and there's legal frameworks around this because that becomes absolutely critical. Now, what I can say is I always kind of share this with people. There's a race on at the moment to become the first billion, and yes, that's with a B rather than an M, the first $1 billion company with one single human employee. And how this is going to be achieved is through using the wonderful worlds of automation, data, and AI, through using things like AI agents that perform many, many tasks that you and I as humans would normally perform inside these businesses. Keep an eye out on this because this is not the future. This is happening right now. So what I can tell you is that it's no longer about if you're going to get started with some of these bits and pieces, but it's rather when. And the convergence of AI, data, and automation, it's here right now. So we've looked at some of the base ingredients, but let's look at a customer story where combining these ingredients have come to life and what the outcomes we've managed to deliver for some customers who get this right. So the story I'm going to share with you today is around a customer of ours called My Plan Manager. And for those of you who may or may not know My Plan Manager, they're in something called the NDIS space, the National Disability Insurance Scheme space. And really what a plan manager does is if you're a person of disability and you need to go see a doctor or someone that can provide you some care, what a plan manager does is they look after that budget and that bucket of money that you might get from the government. I could go, Shaun, see a chiropractor or physiotherapist or whoever I might need to see. And instead of kind of me paying the bill for that, that bill gets sent to my plan manager and my plan manager takes care of all of the payments around it. So my plan manager is the leading plan manager in the NDIS space. And it's a customer that we worked with quite pervasively. And really, this story is such a good story that it landed up in the Australian Financial Review. So I always say it's always good to get kind of mentioned in the Australian Financial Review for good reasons rather than bad. And in this instance, it was one about being really at the forefront, helping everyday Australians using kind of this specific customer story. Now, if I skip to the end of this, what is the outcome that some of this technology gave them? Well, very recently, my plan manager got acquired by a big insurance, a global insurance company called Arthur J. Gallagher. And really what happened is Arthur J. Gallagher wanted to kind of acquire my plan manager because it was a booming business. And it was a booming business because they used technology and very specifically automation, data, and AI to supercharge their business operations. The outcome for them was there was a big payday at the end of it, and they got bought out for roughly $300 million, which is a great outcome for an Australian business. And the reason why they could do this again is because their whole business was built around automation, data, and AI. So what kind of challenge did we solve for them? Well, really what we did and how we used automation, data, and AI in their business is that they receive tens of thousands of invoices every single day from all of these kind of their customers that are going to see different care providers. But very interestingly, an invoice is not simply an invoice. It's got some very, very critical details on it. Things like support codes and who the client was and what their numbers were. And if you can imagine there's tens of thousands of invoices coming in every day, these invoices need to be processed within 3 days. And if they're not processed within 3 days, my plan manager can literally see their customers churning, which is a pretty scary place to be. And of course, we need to get all of those care providers paid within a kind of an acceptable time frame so that they can continue giving care to everyday Australians that need it. The other challenge that they had is if they fell behind, they can't catch up, right? So they would just go and they would fall into kind of further and further backlogs, and they wouldn't be able to throw enough people at the problem to go through and process these invoices. In the beginning, when we started working with them, they had a straight through processing rate of 3%. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is 97% of these incoming invoices or claims had to be touched by one or more human users inside the My Plan Manager business. So you think about that, you've got tens of thousands of these things coming in every day, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and 97% of those had to touch one or more humans. They couldn't throw enough people at the problem. And to be honest, because they have fixed budgets in terms of money they get from the government to help everyday Australians, they couldn't carry on scaling through people. So really what they needed to do was they needed to adopt an automation, data, and AI mindset to solve this specific challenge. Well, the good news is if we look at the outcome, Some of the outcomes we've delivered for My Plan Manager using that combination of automation, data, and AI is we've saved them in excess of 100,000 hours, and that grows every single day, of human time needed to process some of these claims. We started off with a 3% straight through processing rate, and now in excess of 70% of these invoices are processed without touching kind of a My Plan Manager employee. And really what technology allowed us to do here was amplify that human potential. It achieved unprecedented efficiency and drove innovation within inside that company, and it allowed them to thrive in an ever-evolving digital landscape. So in this example, kind of automation, data, and AI was absolutely critical in allowing them to scale, and it kind of evolved into a really, really great kind of Australian success story. So that's just one little story of what automation, data, and AI can do for you. But I'll hand back over to Phoebe. Phoebe, talk to us about kind of some of the legal considerations behind this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Shaun. And I think that example in particular and everything that you're doing in that business really shows that there are some amazing benefits with AI. And I think often people expect lawyers to come in and bring scare tactics and say, no, don't do it. But really, we're just here to help find the guardrails for how to do it legally compliant, safely in the Australian legal landscape. And there is a bit of a misconception as well that the law is really far behind and there aren't laws that apply to this. And that's simply not the case. There are laws. There are some grey areas that we're yet to see fleshed out, but this isn't a lawless space as much as it is a very new technology and a very exciting new explosion of capability. There are laws that we should apply to this. So the first one that I want to jump into is automation, which is most of what Shaun was talking about there. And it's important to know that with the recent privacy reforms that have happened, we've had at the end of last year, I think it was November or December, some major reforms came through, and we're expecting 2 more tranches of that. What those reforms contained an update that essentially said, if you're using automated decision-making in your business, you need to make sure you're disclosing it to customers, users, clients, whoever they may be, through your privacy documentation. So your privacy policy ordinarily is where that would be. And so if you're using automated decision-making to impact someone's rights or interests, this is more than the example that Shaun was just talking about with the My Plan Manager, where it's sort of automating the administrative side of things. It's making some of the day-to-day tasks faster, more efficient, and cheaper. What the law is trying to protect against here is more so when there's automated decision-making happening that could really affect an individual and there's no human oversight. So an example of that would be, for example, if a bank is using automated decision-making to review loan applications and it's granting and denying them based on that, and there isn't really human oversight. So that's an example where it can really impact someone's life and there's no human involved. So that's essentially what we're concerned about here. And it's simply a matter in Australia of making sure that there's adequate disclosure and so that everyone knows that they're using it. An important point to note as well is that the GDPR in the EU and UK is stricter than Australia. They also require disclosure, but they take it one step further in saying that individuals have the right to opt out. So in that same example of a bank, if someone is submitting a loan application, they should be informed at the time that there would be automated decision-making happening, and they should be able to say, I don't want to be subject to this. Most of this, occasionally you can, if you don't really want to be disclosing this, if there's a bit of human oversight, generally it's considered no longer to be, fully automated, but it's just trying to make sure that there's some human safeguards, essentially. So that's something to be aware of, but the main takeaway from automation point of view is just disclosure and transparency to your users about how it's being done. The second point that I want to talk about is inputting personal and sensitive information into AI. And this is something that a lot of you ticked on that poll is something you're concerned about. And we've also received a fair few questions ahead of the seminar about it as well. So hopefully we can address some of those concerns for you. What you can see on this slide is a flowchart that I'd actually prepared to help myself in advising clients digest the information that the Australian privacy regulator, the OAIC, had given us about how can we use AI in a safe and lawful way to process personal information. And so I'll take you through a bit of an example of it, of how it works in action. But this is also an example of where a lot of people think, oh, well, the OAIC hasn't come out with any new, the Privacy Act hasn't been changed to acknowledge AI. And I think the regulator would say, well, we don't need to, it's all the same principles, it's just a new application. So again, not a lawless space, and there are some pretty clear parameters for us to keep in mind. So the number one consideration when you're asking, can I put something into AI? And this is, we're probably talking more here from a practical perspective about large language models. When you're inputting data in that way, often automation, it can sit a little bit to the side of this, but just for conceptually frame where we're at. The key question to start with is this personal information or is it general information? And so personal information will be, does it have a characteristic that can identify an individual? So commonly it's, name, contact information, and the like. And there's some additional subsets of that. If it's general information, you don't have to worry about this framework at all. You can input it, no problem. If it's personal information, that's where this kicks in, and we need to consider what are we allowed to do with it. So the number one consideration when you know it is personal information is this, am I using this information for the primary purpose for which it was given to me or my business? And that comes back to APP 6, which is sort of one of the key tenets of Australian privacy law. And essentially all that means is, if, for example, if a customer comes to your business and gives you their email address, contact information to purchase goods, the primary purpose of giving you that information is to receive your goods. That's what they would expect to be doing that for. And that's what you should be essentially communicating to them. So if you're using AI to help them with that primary purpose of receiving the goods, then that's absolutely permitted. So if we're using it to streamline the shipping process or just to make sure that the order is processed, then that's all consistent with the primary purpose, and that's absolutely fine. Where it gets a bit more complicated is when you're using it for anything beyond that. And that's where we sort of get into, well, is this a secondary purpose category? So using that same example of, is it a business that's selling goods? The question then becomes, okay, well, can I, for example, am I able to use this personal information to put in an AI or a training model and see if I can get insights about the kind of customers that we have? And maybe we can try and find new customers. And so then the question becomes, based on this guidance from the OAIC, well, is this a secondary purpose? Okay, yeah, yes, it's not really connected with the first one. Then the question becomes, do you have the individual's consent? Sometimes you can be very express about this, you're happy to be, and you can get consent and you're off, you can use it. If no, you don't have their consent, there is a secondary category here where we say, well, would that individual reasonably expect that we would be using it for this? And this is a bit of an objective test, but we do recommend caution with it and taking probably a more conservative approach to what people would reasonably expect. Although I think the average consumer assumes a fair bit goes on with their information. If they would reasonably expect it, the question is it still directly related to the primary purpose? And if yes, it's probably okay. It may be okay. We should still make sure there's some safeguards in place. And if no, we shouldn't be using it. So then the question often becomes from businesses, okay, so we do want to do this stuff with it. We don't really want to get consent for whatever reason. It's not really connected to the primary purpose. Can we de-identify it? And the answer is yes, you can, because then it becomes back to this question of, is it personal information? No, it becomes general information. So it's no longer subject to this framework. But, and there is a big but, we need to make sure that we're de-identifying correctly. And this is something that there is a lot of technical debate about at the moment. But essentially, often, before we really understood more about this technology, most people would have assumed that, okay, we can remove, the person's name and address, and that's probably enough. We've de-identified it. But we have learnt through some pretty public trial and error that actually data points can still identify someone. And it is the responsibility of the party that's de-identifying to truly de-identify. So for example, and it may be less relevant for this example of having the individual buying goods from a business, but say we've kept in the suburb that this customer is from, and they've bought, 6 of a baby item, and we know that there is someone in that suburb that has 6 children and they're the only one. That information, which seemingly seems general, has now become identifiable again. And this is particularly important when we consider health and sensitive information. So de-identification can be done, we just need to be cautious with how. And on the point of sensitive health information, the OAIC is pretty strict about this. So they've said we really strongly recommend against putting sensitive information into public AI tools. And when we talk about sensitive, the way that that's defined under the law is it's essentially, health is probably the most common example. It can also include things about an individual's ethnic or racial origins, criminal history, anything that is sort of a nature that's that can provide insight into an individual that's more than just identifying on a surface level, essentially. And so they essentially say we should really be getting consent before you put it into a system. And for health practitioners especially, APRA has come out and said we really should be getting informed consent before we're putting it into an AI tool. And that can easily be done from a legal perspective. It again just comes back to, are we being transparent? Are we arming our users, patients, clients with all the information about their own, how their own personal information is being used? Another important thing to consider when you're inputting information into an AI system, no matter who the provider is that where is that provider based and where are they storing it? And a lot of the time they are overseas. So this kicks in another element of the Privacy Act, where that's essentially then considered an overseas transfer if we're inputting information that is going to the US or the UK. And the Privacy Act basically says that us as a business who's decided to use this provider, we have a responsibility to make sure that that provider is complying with standards that are the same or similar or pretty close to the Australian standard, which most of the big ones are. But there are some resources online that tell us that some of them aren't. So we do have a responsibility to make sure that we're really investigating who we choose to pair with. And this is, I think, an important thing that people forget, that actually we are technically, we're essentially sending something overseas. The next point that I wanted to talk about is IP ownership. And this is another one that we've got a fair few questions about. So hopefully we can touch on it. I will warn, this is an area that there is a lot of debate on, and I'll be touching at it at a high level, but this is probably the area where there is the most grey area, and we're probably yet to see, statute or case law really catch up and tell us what's going on and where the pendulum sort of lands. But we can definitely touch on some of the key concerns, and there are some basic principles that can be applied to help us. So essentially, one of the biggest questions is, well, who owns output when we're talking about AI? And so the output is not quite settled, but it's often a question of all these competing bubbles that you see there. So it's typically, there is ownership that when you look at the service terms of providers that are providing the AI tools, they'll typically have a clause that says you, the user, will own your own outputs, but we typically have a license to use it as well for our own purposes. Then we have the question of, well, can anybody own this if it's come from something that's not human? And this is probably the biggest roadblock to a lot of IP commercialization and ownership. The law has a long history in Australia of essentially saying that if it's not a human, it's not capable of protection. Some commentators argue that essentially if there is enough human input in creating the prompts or manipulating the actual source code behind the prompts, then this might be sufficient human involvement to warrant that it can be capable of protection, but we haven't really got clarity on that yet. The other question, which is, I think, really important and a lot of people can forget, is that the threshold for protection in an IP perspective can be quite high. And in whether we're talking about copyright or patents, usually we're in an IP AI space, we're talking about copyright. There needs to be sufficient originality to even be eligible before we can even ask for this question. And because we know that AI systems work off huge training data sets where they've gotten data from all of these other sources, it's often the case that it isn't really capable of generating anything new and novel. It's sort of just regurgitating other things that it's been given. So that alone can be a huge detractor as to whether or not someone is capable of owning it. And so from a practical perspective, For most part, we've seen that most businesses aren't relying hugely on the output to try and own and commercialize and create assets out of it. But if you are in a more creative space where, say, you're doing, graphic design or something a bit more artistic, it is something to be really cautious of, because at the moment, it's still best to have a human doing that if you want to commercialize it. Another important thing to consider is that if we're taking into account some of the examples that Shaun's given as far as integrations go into your product, it's really helpful to know who owns that integration. And for the most part, like Shaun was saying with that example, when businesses go to sell or to invest, the investors will want to see that you've got your ownership sorted in either way. And oftentimes it is really valuable when you're the owner of that, because it becomes such an important part of, the platform you've created, the business you've created, is these processes. So it's really important to just check those contracts as well and make sure that you're happy with where the ownership position sits. And then the last point I wanted to touch on from an IP perspective is the other side of the coin. The first side being who owns outputs. The second side is, are those outputs inadvertently infringing IP, which is a really big consideration. And this again comes back to this concept of, well, we know that these AI systems are trained off huge data sets where it's generating something that has come before it. And we are yet to see from a technical perspective. There have been some examples in the media where people claimed that there were actual inventions happening, and there was a really high profile one, I think it was Google, who claimed that there had been a medical breakthrough with some of the information that it had basically said, we think we've got a solution to this medical thing. And it turns out they had forgotten that they had accidentally uploaded an unpublished paper on the exact same thing. So we are yet to see it create anything. It's almost always using something else. The mashup may be original and may not have ever happened in that form before, but it's come from somewhere. And so because it's come from somewhere, there is a risk that you are infringing on somebody else's rights. And this is a tricky piece. And we've got some questions about this as well before the seminar. But essentially, this creates a bit of a problem because it's hard to tell where it's come from. Not all AI systems give you a clear source of where they've gotten certain language from, certain artworks from, or whatever it may be. And so there's a risk then that we've taken it from someone and we don't know who. To mitigate this, the second part of this that a lot of people say was, well, how are they ever going to find out? How are they ever really going to enforce those rights if the original artist, can figure it out? How does this happen? And from a practical standpoint, what we often say to our clients is, well, just be cautious about what is the output that you are relying on. So can you use the AI agent or tool or whatever it may be to help draft some client communication and help with some of the things that might be speeding up day-to-day life? That's probably, no one's going to come and sue you for an email. Realistically, it's not going to happen. But if you're using it to create an entire advertising campaign and it's giving you, specific images and ideas and concepts, that is going to be more public. It's going to potentially expose your business to more risk. So it's just a matter of being strategic about, if we are doing something that we want to commercialize, that's going to be public, that's going to be an asset for us, should we move this away from AI? Just to make sure that we're not infringing and that we can have ownership of it. So that's essentially the key takeaway there. And considering the key takeaways overall, I know we've said a lot there, but hopefully it all made sense. These are my top ones from a legal perspective, and I'll let Shaun give his closing thoughts as well. But essentially, review your contracts, make sure IP ownership is clear when you're engaging a provider, if they're doing any integration for you. Review your privacy documentation, especially your privacy policy. Make sure you've been clear and you've been disclosing things that you need to where relevant. Observe how your individuals in your business are actually using AI. A lot of the time, individuals are doing their own thing. and I think we don't need to discourage them. We just need to make sure we know how they're using it and if that use is likely to cause any risks to the business. And then based on that assessment of how individuals are actually using AI in their day-to-day roles, it can be really helpful to have some training as well on basically these concepts, particularly around personal information and around IP ownership. So those are my key takeaways. Shaun, let me know yours as well.
Yeah, thanks, Phoebe. I think, yeah, I'll echo that. So a few things. I think I'll end off with, to be honest, it's no longer about if you're going to do this anymore. It's rather when. So if you're going to do this, make sure you just do it responsibly, right? So there's lots of great verbiage out there. There's lots of great papers that have been published. You can absolutely use this technology in a safe and secure way. I think I saw a couple of the questions that were pre-submitted just before the event. I think a lot of people ask questions about, okay, well, if I input something into the public version of ChatGPT, like whose data is that? Well, the saying always goes, if you're not paying for something, you are the product. So bear that in mind, right? So if you want to be safe and secure, make sure you either sign up for paid versions of them, make sure you check out some of the T's and C's behind it. There's a very common use case out there where some of the core Samsung technology engineers put some source code into the public version of ChatGPT, and they reserve the right to retrain some of those models based off of information. So don't be like them. Make sure you use it in a safe, secure way. There's many, many ways that you can do that. We can spin up these models internally for your company, which means you can push data in there without any of the risks associated with data leakage or the like. So yeah, I think it's no longer about if you're going to start, but when. Just make sure you do it responsibly, and there's heaps of great ways that you can do it responsibly.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. Thank you, Shaun. Okay, so that concludes the main part of our webinar. You might also find this fact sheet useful. It's about notifiable data breaches, which is obviously something very closely connected to privacy. And you can download that for free if you're interested by scanning that information. You might also be interested in our next upcoming webinar, which is about resolving business disputes without breaking the bank, because they can be expensive. And that's next Thursday, 19th of June at 11 a.m. And we're going to answer your questions shortly, but before we do that, and feel free to submit them now, although we will get to some pre-submitted ones as well. I just wanted to take a minute to tell you about LegalVision's membership. By becoming a LegalVision member, your business gets unlimited access to our full team of over 100 specialist lawyers for all of your BAU needs. And it's essentially like having in-house counsel, but for a fraction of the cost. So membership includes unlimited drafting and reviewing, unlimited legal advice consultations, and unlimited domestic trademark registration. So as a LegalVision member, you don't have to worry about the cost of lawyers ever again. It's like having your own in-house counsel. We'll take care of the BAU needs, and you can focus on running your business. We also, if you are in-house counsel, we do also offer a dedicated service to manage high volume business as usual legal tasks. So if you have any interest in that, or you've got any questions, just follow the survey at the end. Okay, so we've gone too far. Q&A. Let's jump into some questions. Now, I might just have a look at couple of the pre-submitted ones. There were quite a lot, so if we don't get to your questions, apologies, and feel free to get in touch afterwards if you're dying to know the answer. So one of the questions that's come through is, how can you ensure compliance when storing data such as HR records in online SaaS tools? And I think that's a really great question. And hopefully one of the points that I touched on when we were considering the privacy framework addressed that. But just to make it extra clear, you should be making sure that you're reviewing the terms with that SaaS provider and understanding, where the responsibility lies. You should also, as an Australian company, be making sure that their privacy compliance is up to scratch with the Australian standard, which frankly isn't that high. We're not one of the most strict ones, so it shouldn't be that hard to hit, but we should be making sure that they're at least at that level. So especially if they're overseas, we just need to be making sure that they're compliant with that. You can be, storing HR records because that would be probably sensitive information with a provider like that. We just need to make sure that there's some security safeguards. So using that OAIC framework, that's very helpful. And then on top of that, I'd strongly recommend having a big deep dive into the terms and getting them probably legally reviewed to help with that. Okay, just having a look at another question. Do we need to get explicit permission for using de-identified data collected from survey forms as training data for in-house LLM development and subsequent use? So if you were using it without de-identifying, probably you need consent, yes. And that comes back to that framework we were talking about, where it's probably a secondary purpose. So you likely need to get consent. If, however, you're de-identifying it, it will become general again. So no, you don't need consent. Just make sure you're de-identifying it correctly. Might hand over to you, Shaun, if you've got one you want to tackle.
Yeah, Phoebe, I'll pick up on that. So often people ask about de-identifying data or redacting data, right? Before you might use that data in some way, shape, or form. Funny enough, we build a lot of automations in that space where we can identify personally identifiable information, credit card data, TFN numbers, and we can automatically redact or de-identify that data. So bear in mind, there's actually also an automation solve for being able to de-identify data. Another question someone asked was around what is the best way to get started, right? So how do you get started on this journey on automation, data, and AI? Well, one of the ways that we help customers get started is we start off with something called an Art of the Possible workshop. And that's really where we action pack a session with real world examples of how we've used automation, data, and AI to solve different real world problems. Then what we do is we go around the room, we ask people if that resonated, we ask people for their ideas, like what are they thinking about using automation, data, and AI for? And then we say no idea is a bad idea, but what we're looking for is what we call a bright idea. And what we do there is we choose one or more of those ideas and we do something that we call an automation evaluation on those. That's where we ask you to take us through the idea, we ask questions on it, and we come back to you with what we call an automation evaluation, which tells you three very important things. Do we believe it's a good idea for an automation? Yes or no? If so, what is the outcome you're going to get? So are you going to save time, make more money? Is it because you have to? What is the outcome you're going to get to? And thirdly, and most importantly, what does that look like from a cost perspective? So it's a beautiful methodology that we follow, very, very easy to follow. It gives you support for every step of the way in your automation, data, and AI journey. So I hope that helps. Phoebe, back to you.
Okay, great. So one question that we've got is, when you're inputting personal information in AI, how does this apply to a resume when all of the details on the resume are also publicly available on something like LinkedIn? And I think that's a really interesting question. It is still considered personal information in the eyes of the law. When we consider something like confidential information, which is more like know-how or something of a business, when that becomes public, it loses its confidential status. Personal information is basically always personal information. What I would say, though, is when we're talking about all of this framework of protection, what we're ultimately trying to prevent against is breaches. That's the ultimate goal with a lot of this. It's misuse of personal information and the personal information getting into the wrong hands. And so if you're, using a person's name or if resume information that's already on their LinkedIn and it gets into the wrong hands and they misuse it, the assessment then becomes what's the harm? And for something like that, which is very publicly findable, already out in the world, the question of, well, what's the harm of someone knowing your name is very little. So it changes the characteristic of why we're so concerned, but we do need to still treat it the same. But I think that's a really interesting question. And I think something people often get confused with the concept of confidential information versus personal information. And if it's about a person, it's always going to be personal information and it's going to have that characteristic pretty much forever. Another interesting one we got, and this is something that's come out of the recent privacy reforms that have come through last year, is there is a new statutory tort for serious breaches of privacy, meaning there is a right for individuals to sue, whereas before we were kind of always relying on the regulator to come down with the hammer and punish people for doing the wrong thing. There is now an individual right to sue someone. And so this question that's come through is, do you see the new statutory tort for serious breach of privacy being enlivened by improper AI use at all? In theory, yes, it should be. The thing with civil rights to sue is it takes a pretty financially big, deep pockets to actually be able to actually do anything about it. And it'll be interesting to see who, if anyone, decides to go down that path. I think there is also a question of, it can be difficult to have transparency on how a business may have misused your personal information until something goes quite wrong. And so far, we haven't seen any huge examples of that. But the right is there. I suspect we will see some use of it, and it's just a matter of when, really. Have you got another one, Shaun?
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of great questions. So thank you. Keep them coming. I'll pick up one from the Q&A thread from Debbie. So Debbie's question was, using the My Plan Manager example, does automation leave the business or the NDIS more open to fraud? It'd be a great question, and it's actually quite the opposite. So, if you went onto the My Plan Manager LinkedIn page, they published some statistics of the amount of money they've actually managed to save the NDIS because they've proactively identified different fraud cases. And that ranges from one of the most common kind of fraud in the accounts payable world is I intercept an invoice. I then change the bank account details from the companies to mine. I submit that as normal. It looks normal. And then someone goes and pays that money into my bank account rather than the person it was intended for. Now, using automation, we can automatically figure out, well, what were the last 3, 5, 10 bank account details we paid that supplier? And if it mismatches, let's loop in a human user and get them to verify that. So that is one way, but that is one of a plethora of examples that we've actually helped My Plan Manager with to identify fraud cases, clamp down on it, and the net result and outcome is we've saved the NDIS, and to be honest, you and I as taxpayers, millions and millions of dollars by preventing some of this fraud.
Yeah, great. I think that's been some really interesting questions and hopefully answers from us there. There are a few more that have been submitted that I think hopefully we've addressed in the seminar itself. If we haven't, feel free to get in touch afterwards. I think Shaun and myself are both professionally and personally passionate about this, and I think there's a lot of discussion in here that is something that I could talk about for hours. So thank you so much for participating and getting involved. And yeah, if you've got any questions, feel free to get in touch afterwards. But that concludes our webinar. So thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.